The little friend. Some nice uncopyrighted music. Is that it? Very short musical interlude. That's fine with me, I guess. Get right to this book then. Get right to the book then, bruv. Got the assistance of some caffeine, since I'm partially dying from some malady, which prevented me from reading last night. Forced me into the bathtub. Some sort of a goo. All right, bros. There we are. The little friend. Commencing with page 485. Oh, Lord. The top of the water tank was more rickety than Harriet remembered. Furred grade boards with nails popped loose in some places, and in others dark gaps where the wood had shrunk and split. Peppering it all were plump white fish hooks and squiggle bird dropping. Harriet from the ladder examined it at eye level. Then she stepped up cautiously and began to climb toward the middle, as something tore loose in her chest as a plank screeched and sank sharply under her foot, like a pressed piano key. Carefully, she took a giant step backward. The plank sprang up with a shriek. Stiff, heart pounding, she crept to the margin of the tank, by the railing where the boards were more stable. Why was the air so strange and thin up high? Altitude sickness. Pilots and mountain climbers suffered from it, and whatever those words actually meant, they described how she felt. A queasiness in her stomach and sparkles at the corners of her eyes. Tin roofs glittered in the hazy distance. On the other side lay the dense green woods where she and Healy had played so often, fighting their all-day wars, bombing each other with clods of red mud, a jungle lush and singing, a palmy little Vietnam to parachute into. She circled the tank twice. The door was nowhere to be seen. She was just starting to think that there wasn't a door at all when at last she noticed it. Weather-worn, almost perfectly camouflaged in the monotone surface except for a chip or two of chrome paint that hadn't quite peeled off the handle. She dropped to her knees. With a wide windshield wiper swing of her arm, she pulled it open, squeaky hinges like a horror movie, and dropped it with a bang which vibrated in the boards beneath her. Inside, dark, a bad smell. A low, intimate whine of mosquitoes hung in the stagnant air. From the roof, a prickle of tiny sun shafts, narrow as pencils, bristled from the holes up top and crisscrossed in dusty beams which were powdery and pollen heavy, like goldenrod in the darkness. Below, the water was thick and inky, the color of motor oil. At the far end, she made out the dim form of a bloated animal floating on its side. A corroded metal ladder, rickety, rusted half through, went down for about 6 feet, stopping just short of the water. As her eyes adjusted to the dim, she saw with a thrill that something shiny was taped to the top rung, a package of some sort, rolled up in a black plastic garbage bag. Harriet prodded it with her toe of her shoe. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she got on her stomach and reached inside, and something soft but solid was inside. Not money, nothing stacked or sharp or definite, but something that gave under pressure like sand. It's what the title says. The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. The package was bound around and around with heavy duct tape. Harriet picked and pulled at it, tugged with both hands, tried to work her fingernails under the edges of the tape. Finally, she gave up and tore through several layers of plastic right into the heart of the package. Inside, something slick and cool, dead to the touch. Harriet withdrew her hand quickly. Dust sifted from the package, spread upon the water in a pearly film. Harriet peered down at the dry iridescence. Poison? Explosives? Swirling in a powdery glaze upon the surface. She knew all about narcotics from TV, from the colored pictures in her health workbook, but those were flamboyant, unmistakable, hand-rolled cigarettes, hypodermics, colorful pills. Maybe this was a decoy package like Andrea. Maybe the real package was hidden elsewhere, and this was just a well-wrapped bag of what? Inside the torn bag, something gleamed, shiny and pale. Carefully, Harriet pushed aside the plastic and saw a mysterious nest of shiny white sacks, like a cluster of giant insect eggs. One of them toppled into the water with a plunk. Harriet drew her hand back fast and floated there, half submerged like a jellyfish. For an awful instant, she thought the sacks were alive in the watery reflections, dancing in the tank's interior. They had seemed to pulsate slightly. Now she saw that they were nothing more than a number of clear plastic bags, each packed with white powder. Harriet cautiously reached down and touched one of the tiny bags. The little blue line of the Ziploc was plainly visible at the top, and then lifted it out and hefted it in her hand. The powder looked white, like sugar or salt, but the texture was crunchier and more crystalline, and the weight curiously light. She opened it and brought it to her nose. No smell except for a faint, clean aroma that reminded her of the Comet powder that Ida used to clean the bathroom. Well, whatever it was his. With an underhand toss, she threw the little bag into the water. There it floated. Harriet looked at it, and then, without much considering what she was doing or why, she reached inside the cachet of black plastic. More white sacks clustered like seeds in a pod, and pulled them out and dropped them by idle handfuls, 3s and 4s into the black water. Now that they were in the car, Farish had forgotten what was eating him, or so it seemed. As Danny drove through cotton fields hazy with morning heat and pesticides, he kept glancing nervously at Farish, who was settled back in his seat and humming along with the radio. Hardly had they turned off the gravel onto the blacktop than Farish's tense, violent mood had shifted, inexplicably, to a happier key. He'd closed his eyes and breathed a deep, contented sigh at the cool air blasting out of the air conditioner, and now they were flying along the highway into town, listening to the morning show with Betty Brownell, Casey McMasters, on WNAT, worst noise around town, as Farish claimed. The call letters stood for. WNAT was top 40, which Farish hated, but now he was liking it, nodding his head, drumming on his knees, the armrest, the dashboard, except he was drumming a little too hard. It made Danny nervous. The older Farish got, the more he behaved like their father. The particular way he smiled before he said something mean, the unnatural liveliness, talkative, overly friendly, that before a bad outburst. Rebelliant. Once Danny had said that word in school, rebelliant, his father's favorite word, and the teacher told him it wasn't even a word. But Danny could still hear that high, crazy crack in his father's voice. Rebellion. The belt came down hard on the bell as Danny stared at his hands, freckled, porous, hatched with scars, white-knuckled from clutching the kitchen table. Danny knew his own hands very well indeed. Every hard, bad moment in his life, he'd studied them like a book. They were a ticket back in time to beatings, deathbeds, funerals, failure, to humiliation on the playground, and sentencing in the courtroom, to memories more real than this steering wheel, this street. Now they were on the outskirts of town. They drove by the shady grounds of the old hospital, where some high school cheerleaders in a V formation jumped all at once into the air. Hey! They weren't in uniform or even in matching shirts. And despite their crisp, unified movements, they looked ragged. Arms chopped in semaphore, fists struck the air. Another day, any other, Danny might have parked behind the old pharmacy and watched them in privacy. Now, as he drove slowly through the dappled leaf shade ponytails and tan limbs flashing in the background, he was chilled by the sudden appearance in the foreground of a smaller, hunchback sort of creature, all in black, which, megaphone in hand, stopped in its soggy, squelchy walk to observe him. Sidewalk. It was something like a small black goblin, scarcely 3 feet tall, with orange beak and big orange feet, and a strangely drenched look. As the car went by, it turned in a smooth tracking motion and opened its black wings like a bat, and Danny had the uncanny sensation that he'd met it before, this creature, part blackbird, part dwarf, part devilish child, that somehow, despite the improbability of such a thing, he remembered it from somewhere. Even stranger, that it remembered him. And as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw it again, a small black form with black wings looking after his car like an unwelcome little messenger from the other world. Boundaries wearing thin, Danny's scalp tingled. The lush road had taken on the quality of a conveyor belt corridor in a nightmare. Deep green feverish shade pressing in on either side. He looked in the mirror. The creature was gone. It wasn't the drugs. He'd sweated those out in his sleep. No, the river had flooded its banks, and all sorts of trash and outrageous garbage had floated up from the bottom and into the daylight. Disaster film, dreams and memories and unconfessable fears, slopping down the public street. And Danny had, not for the first time, the sensation that he had dreamed this day already, that he was driving down Natchez Street towards something that had already taken place. He rubbed his mouth. He had to pee. As bad as his ribs and his head hurt from Farish's beating, he could think of little else but how badly he had to pee. And coming off the drugs had left him with a sick chemical undertaste in his mouth. He stole a glance at Farish. He was still caught up in the music, nodding his head, humming to himself, drumming on the armrest with his knuckle. But the police dog bitch in the back seat glared at Danny as if she knew exactly what was on his mind. He tried to psych himself up. Eugene, for all his holy rolling, would look after Curtis. And then there was Gum. Her very name triggered an avalanche of guilty thoughts. But though Danny bore down hard and willed himself to feel affection for his grandmother, he felt nothing. Sometimes, especially when he heard Gum coughing in her room in the middle of the night, he got all choked up and sentimental about the hardships she'd suffered, the poverty, the overwork, the cancers and the ulcers, and the arthritis and all the rest of it. But love was an emotion he felt for his grandmother, only in her presence, and then only occasionally, never out of it. And what did any of that even matter? Danny had to pee so bad that his eyeballs were about to burst. He squeezed his eyes shut, opened them again. I'll send money home as soon as I move that shit and set myself up. Was there another way? No, there was no way, apart from what lay ahead of him. To the house by the water in another state. He had to fix his mind on that future. Really see it, move toward it smoothly and without stopping. They drove past The old Alexandria Hotel, with its sagging porch and rotten shutters, haunted people. Haunted, people said, and no wonder. All the people who had died there, you could feel it radiating from the place. All that old historical death, and Danny wanted to howl at the universe that had dumped him here in this hellhole town, in this broken down county that hadn't seen money since the Civil War. His first felony conviction hadn't even been his fault. It was his father's for sending him to steal a ridiculously expensive Stihl chainsaw from the workshop of a rich old German farmer who was sitting up guarding his property with a gun. It was pathetic now to think back on how he'd looked forward to his release from jail, counting the days until he got to go home. Because the thing he hadn't understood, he was happier not knowing it, was that once you were in prison, you never get out or got out. People treated you like a different person. You tended to backslide the way people tended to backslide into malaria or bad alcoholism. The only thing for it was to go someplace that nobody knew you and nobody knew your family and try to start your life all over again. Street signs repeating and words, Natchez, 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 Chamber of Commerce, Alexandria, the way things ought to be. No, not the way things ought to be, Danny thought bitterly. It's the way things fucking are. Sharply, he turned into the freight yards. Ferris clutched the dashboard and looked at him with something like astonishment. What you doing? This is where you told me to go, Danny said, trying to keep his tone as neutral as possible. I did? Danny felt he should say something, but he didn't know what to say. Had Ferris mentioned the tower? All of a sudden, he wasn't sure. You said you was going to check up on me, he said tentatively, just tossing it out there, just to see what might happen. Ferris shrugged, and to Danny's surprise, settled back in his seat again and looked out the window. Driving around tended to put him in a good mood. Danny could still hear Ferris's low whistle the first time he pulled up in the Trans Am. How he loved to ride, just climb in the car and go. In those first few months, they'd joyride it up to Indiana, just the two of them. Another time all the way to West Texas. No reason, nothing to see in those places, just clear weather and the highway signs flashing overhead, punching around on the FM band looking for a song. Tell you what, let's go get us some breakfast, Ferris said. Danny's intentions wavered. He was hungry. Then he remembered his plan. It was settled. It was fixed. It was the only way out. Black wings waving him around the corner into a future he couldn't see. He didn't turn. He kept driving. Trees crowded close to the car. They were so far off the paved road that it wasn't even a road anymore, just potholes and rutted gravel. Just trying to find a place to turn around, he said, realizing how stupid it sounded even as he said it. Then he stopped the car. It was a good long walk from the tower. The road was bad, and the weeds were high. He didn't care to drive any farther and risk getting stuck. The dogs started barking like crazy, jumping all over the place and trying to push their way into the front seat. Danny turned as if to get out of the car. Here we are, he said nonsensically. Quickly, he pulled the little pistol out of his boot and pointed it at Ferris. But Ferris didn't see. He had turned sideways in the seat, swinging his large stomach around towards the door. Get down from there, he was saying to the bitch named Van Zant. Down, I said, down. He raised his hand. The dog shrank. Try it with me. Try that rebellion shit with me. He had not so much as glanced at Danny or the gun. To get his attention, Danny had to clear his throat. Ferris raised a dirty red hand. Hold your horses, he said without looking. Hang on, I gotta discipline this dog. I'm sick of you. Whack on the head. You sorry bitch. You pull this uppity shit on me. He and the dog glared at each other. Her ears were pinned against her skull. Her yellow eyes glowed steadily. Go on, do it. I'll whack you so hard. No, wait, he said, raising an arm and half turning to Danny with the bad eyes towards him. I got to teach this bitch a lesson. It was as cold and blue as an oyster, that bad eye. Go on, he said to the dog. Try it. It'll be the last time you ever. Danny pulled back the hammer and shot Ferris in the head. Like that, just that fast. Crack. Ferris's head snapped forward and his mouth fell open. With a gesture that was strangely easy, he reached for the dashboard to brace himself. and then turned towards Danny, his good eye half shut, but his blind one wide open. A bubble of spit mixed with blood came blopping out of his mouth. He looked like a fish, like a hooked mud cat. Blop, blop. Danny shot him again in the neck this time, and in the silence that rang and dissolved about him in tinny circles, got out of the car and slammed the door. It was done now, no going back. Blood had sprayed across the front of his shirt. He touched his cheek and looked at the rusty smear on his fingertips. Farish had collapsed forward with his arms on the dash. His neck was a mess, but his mouth, full of blood, was still moving. Sable, the smaller of the two dogs, had his paws over the back of the passenger seat, and rear legs pedaling, was working to clamber over it and on top of his master's head. The other dog, the motherfucker, the bitch named Van Zant, had scrambled over from the back seat. With her nose down, she circled twice, reversed direction, and then plunked her rear end down in the driver's seat. Her black ears pricked up like a devil's. For a moment, she glared at Danny with her wolfish eyes and then began to bark. Short, sharp barks, clear and carrying. The alarm was as plain as if she was shouting, "Fire! Fire!" Danny stepped backwards. A multitude of birds had flown up like shrapnel at the small crack of the gun. Now they were settling again in the trees, on the ground. Blood was everywhere inside his car. Blood on the windshield, on the dashboard, on the passenger window. I should have had breakfast, he thought hysterically. When did I eat? And with this thought, he became aware that more than anything, he needed to urinate, and had needed to desperately since the very instant he woke that morning. A wonderful relief descended upon him and seeped into his bloodstream. Everything's fine, he thought as he zipped his pants up, and then his beautiful car, his car. Moments ago it had been a showpiece, and now it was a crime scene from True Detective. Within moved frantically back and forth. Ferris laid slumped over the dashboard, face down. His posture was strangely relaxed and natural. He might have bent forward to look for dropped keys, except for the rich pool of blood spreading from his head and ticking to the ground. Blood was sprayed all over the windshield, fat, dark, glossy drops, a spray of fat florist's holly berries clinging to the glass. In the back seat, Sable rushed back and forth, his tail thumping against the windows. Van Zant, seated beside her master, lunged toward him in quick, repeated feints, nudging his cheek with her nose, pulling back, springing forward to nudge him again, and barking, those short, piercing barks, which, she was a dog, damn it, but yet that short, sharp urgency was unmistakable, as good as a raised voice shouting for help. Danny rubbed his chin and looked around wildly. Whatever itch had goaded him to pull the trigger was gone now, while his troubles had multiplied until they blackened out the sun. Why on earth had he shot Farish inside the car? If only he'd held out for 2 seconds. But no, he'd been dying to get it over with, had jumped like an idiot to pull the trigger, and got his shot off instead of waiting for the right moment. He crouched over, put his hands on his knees. He felt sick and clammy. His heart was hammering, and he hadn't eaten a square meal in weeks. Nothing but junk. Ice cream sandwiches and 7-Up. The hard adrenaline slap had drained away, and with it what little strength he had, and he wanted nothing so bad in all the world as to lie down on the hot green ground and close his eyes. He stared at the ground as if hypnotized, then shook himself and pulled himself aright. A little bump would fix him right up. A bump. Good God, the thought made his eyes water. But he left the house with nothing on him, and the last thing he wanted to do was open the car door and root around on Farish's body, zipping and unzipping the pockets on that filthy old shitty UPS coverall. He limped around to the front of the car. Van Zant lunged at him, and her snout hit the windshield with a cracking thump that sent him reeling back. Amidst the sudden rackets of barks, he stood still for a moment with his eyes closed, breathing shallowly, trying to steady his nerves. He didn't want to be here, but here he was, and he was going to have to start thinking now, taking it slow, one baby step at a time. It was the birds, rising in a noisy clamor, which startled Harriet. All at once they exploded around her so that she flinched and flung her arm over her eyes. 4 or 5 crows settled near her, clasping the railing of the tank with their feet. They turned their heads to look at her, and the nearest crow walloped his wings and took off. Below, far away, she could hear something that sounded like dogs barking, dogs going nuts. But before this, it seemed to her she'd heard a different noise, a slight crack, very faint in the windy, sun-bleached distance. Harriet, feet on the ladder, legs in the tank, sat without moving. As her gaze strayed in confusion, one of the birds caught her eye. It had a jaunty, wicked look like a cartoon bird, cocking its head right at her, and it almost looked as if it was about to say something. But as she looked at it, another popping sound echoed from below, and the bird drew itself up and flew off. Harriet listened, half in, half out of the tank. She stood part way, bracing herself with one hand, and winced as the ladder squealed beneath her weight. Hastily, she clambered onto the planks and crawled to the edge of her hands and knees and craned over as far as she could. Down below, far across the field, towards the woods, too far to see very well, was the Trans Am. Birds were starting to drop down to the clearing again, settling one by one, lighting in the branches, in the bushes, on the ground. By the car, a long way off, stood Danny Ratliff. He had his back to her, and his hands were clapped over his ears like somebody was screaming at him. Harriet ducked. His posture, tense and violent, had frightened her, and the next moment she realized what she'd seen. And slowly she rose again. Yes, bright red, sprayed in drops on the windshield, so bright and shocking it popped out even at a distance. Beyond, within the car, beyond the semi-transparent scrim of droplets, she had the impression of horrible movement. Something thrashing and thumping, flailing around, and whatever it was, that dark confusion, Danny Ratliff seemed frightened of it too. His backward steps were slow, robotic, like the last few backward steps of a shot cowboy in the movies. Harriet was overcome all of a sudden with a strange blankness and languor. From where she was so high up, it all looked flat and unimportant somehow, accidental. The sun beat down white and fierce, and in her head thrummed the same curious, airy lightness that, when she was climbing, had made her feel like relaxing her grip and letting go. I'm in trouble, she told herself, big trouble, but it was hard to make herself feel it, even though it was true. In the bright distance, Danny Ratliff stooped to pick up something shiny on the grass, and Harriet's heart gave a queasy flutter when she realized, more from the way that he was holding it than anything else, that it was a gun. In the dreadful silence, she imagined for a moment that she could hear a faint strain of trumpet music. Healy's marching band to the east, far away, and when, in confusion, she cast her eye over in that direction, it seemed to her that the slightest gold twinkle, like sun-striking brass, flashed up in the hazy distance. Birds everywhere, great black cawing explosions of them, like radioactive fallout, like shrapnel. They were a bad sign, words and dreams and laws and numbers, storms of information in his head, indecipherable on the wings and spiraling. Danny put his hand over his ears. He could see his own reflection slanted in the blood-splattered windshield. A whirling red galaxy frozen on glass, clouds moving in a thin film behind his head. He was sick and exhausted. He needed a shower and a good meal. He needed to be home in bed. He didn't need this shit. I shot my brother, and why? Because I needed to take a leak so bad I couldn't think straight. Farish would get a big yuck out of that. 6 stories in the newspaper. He laughed his head off. The drunk who'd slipped while peeing off an overpass and fallen to his death on the highway. The dumbass who'd awakened to a ringing telephone at his bedside and reached for his pistol and shot himself in the head. The gun lay in the weeds at Danny's feet where he'd dropped it, stiffly bent to retrieve it. Sable was sniffing around Farish's cheek and neck with a rooting, budding motion that made Danny queasy, while Van Zant tracked his every move with her acid yellow eyes. When he stepped towards the car, she reached back and seemed to be saying, When he stepped towards the car, she reared back and barked with renewed energy. Just you open that car door, she seemed to be saying. Just you open that motherfucking door. Danny thought of the training sessions out in the backyard, where Farish rolled his arms and quilt batting in burlap sacks and yelled, "Destroy, destroy," cottony little puffs floating all over the yard. His knees were trembling. He rubbed his mouth, tried to compose himself. Then he took aim with his arm at the yellow eye of the dog, Van Zant, and squeezed the trigger. A hole the size of a silver dollar exploded in the window. Gritting his teeth against the screams, the thrashing and sobbing inside the car, Danny leaned down with his eye to the glass and put the pistol through the hole and shot her again. Then angled the gun and got in a good clear center shot at the other one. Then he pulled back his arm and threw the gun away from him as far as he could. He stood in the morning glare, panting as if he'd run a mile. The screaming from the car was the worst noise he'd ever heard in his life, high, unearthly, like broken machinery, a metallic sobbing note that went on and on without fatigue, a noise that gave Danny actual pain. So he felt that if it didn't stop, he'd have to drive a stick in his ear. But it didn't stop, and after what seemed a ridiculously long time, standing there with his back half turned, Danny walked stiffly to where he'd thrown the gun, with the screams of the dog still ringing in his ears. Grimly, he got down on his knees and searched through the thin weeds, parting them with his hands, and his back tensed against the keen, energetic cries. But the gun was empty, no more bullets. Danny wiped it clean with his shirt and tossed it deeper in the woods. He was on the verge of forcing himself over to the car to look when silence rolled in on him. In crushing waves, each wave with its own crest and fall, like the screams which had preceded them. She'd been walking over with our coffee, he thought, rubbing his mouth. If I drove on to the White Kitchen, if I hadn't turned down this road, the waitress named Tracy, the scrawny one with the dangly earrings and the little flat ass, always brought it without asking. He imagined Farish pushed back in his chair with his stomach preceding him grandly, delivering the speech he always gave about his eggs, how he didn't like to drink 'em. Tell the cook she couldn't get 'em too hard, and Danny across the table looking at his matted old nasty head like black seaweed and thinking, you never know how close I come. All that vanished, and he found himself staring at a broken bottle in the weeds. He opened and shut one hand, then the other. His palms were slimy and cold. I got to get moving here, he thought, with a rush of panic. And yet he stood. It was like he'd blown the fuse connecting his body with his brain. Now that the car window was shattered and the dogs had shut up wailing and crying, he could hear just the faintest thread of music drifting from the radio. Did those people who sang that song, some shit about stardust in your hair, did they ever think for a minute that somebody'd be listening to it on a dirt road by an abandoned railroad track with a dead body in front of them? No, those people just swished around Los Angeles and Hollywood in their white outfits with sparkles, and their sun dark at the top and clear at the bottom, drinking champagne and snorting coke off of silver trays. They never figured, standing there in the studio by their grand pianos, with their sparkly scarves and their fancy cocktails, they never figured that some poor person was going to be standing on a dirt road in Mississippi and working through some major problems while the radio played on the day that you were born, the angels got together. People like that never had to make a tough decision, he thought dully, staring at his blood-spattered vehicle. They never had to do shit. It was all handed to them like a set of new car keys. He took a step towards the car, one step. His knees trembled. The crunch of his feet on the gravel terrified him. Got to move, he told himself with a kind of high, heartsy hysteria, looking wildly all around him, left, right, up in the sky, and a hand out to brace himself in case he fell. Get this show on the road. It was clear enough what he had to do. The question was how, since there was no getting around the fact that basically he would rather take a hacksaw and cut his arm off than lay a finger on his brother's body. On the dashboard, resting quite naturally, lay his brother's grubby red hand, tobacco-stained fingers, that big gold pinky ring, shaped like a dice. As Danny stared at it, he tried to think his way back into the situation. What he needed was a bump to concentrate his mind and get his heart up and kicking. Upstairs in the tower, there was plenty of product, Product galore, and the longer he stood around, the longer the Trans Am would stand in the weeds with a dead man and 2 dead police dogs bleeding on the seats. Harriet, gripping the rail with both fists, lay on her stomach, too terrified to breathe. Because her feet were above her head, all the blood had drained down to her face so that her heartbeat crashed in her temples. The screams from the car had ceased, the sharp, high animal wails that had seemed as if they would never end. But even the silence seemed stretched and torn out of shape by those unearthly cries. There he still stood, Danny Ratliff, down on the ground, looking very small in the flat, placid distance. It was all as still as a picture. Every blade of grass, every leaf on every tree seemed combed and oiled and slicked into place. Harriet's elbows were sore. She shifted slightly in her trying position. She was unsure what she'd seen. She was too far away, but the gunshots and the cries she heard plainly enough, and the afterburn of the screams still rang in her ears. High-pitched, scalding, intolerable. All movement in the car had stopped. His victims, dark forms, more than one, it seemed, were still. Suddenly he turned, and Harriet's heart clenched painfully. Please, God, she prayed. Please, God, don't let him come up here. But he was walking towards the woods. Swiftly, after a backwards glance, he stooped in the clearing. A band of custard white skin at odds with the dark brown tan on his arms appeared, a crack between his t-shirt and the waistband of his jeans. He broke the gun and examined it. He stood and scoured it clean with his shirt. Then he threw it towards the woods, and the gun's shadow flew dark over the weedy ground. Oh, I'm gonna sneeze. That was exciting. Then he threw it towards the woods, and the gun's shadow flew dark over the weedy ground. Harriet, peeping over her forearm at all this, fought a strong impulse to look away. Though she was desperate to know what he was doing, still it was a curious strain to keep her gaze fixed so intently on the same bright, distant spot, and she had to shake her head against the kind of fog that kept creeping over her vision, like the darkness that slid over the numbers on the chalkboard at school when she stared at them too hard. After a while, he turned from the woods and walked back to the car. There he stood with his sweaty, muscled back to her, his head slightly down, his arms rigidly at his side. His shadow lay tall before him on the gravel, a black plank pointing at 2 o'clock. In the glare, it was comforting to look at, the shadow restful and cool to the eyes. Then it slid away and vanished as he turned and began to walk towards the tower. Harriet's stomach dropped away. The next instant she recovered herself, fumbled for the gun, began to unwrap it with stammering fingers. All at once, an old pistol that she didn't know how to shoot, and wasn't even sure she'd loaded right, seemed a very small thing to put between herself and Danny Ratliff, especially in so precarious a spot. Her gaze skipped around, where to position herself, here or on the other side, a little lower down maybe. Then she heard a clang on the metal ladder. Frantically, Harriet glanced around. She'd never shot a gun in her life. Even if she hit him, she wouldn't drop him instantly, and the rickety roof of the tank afforded no ground for retreat. Clang, clang, clang. Harriet, feeling it in her body for a moment, the terror of being bodily grabbed and thrown off the side, floundered to her feet. But just as she was about to fling herself, gun and all, down through the trapdoor and into the water, something stopped her. Arms walloping, she reared back and recovered her balance. The tank was a trap, bad enough to meet him face on in the sunlight, but down there she wouldn't have a chance. Clang, clang, the gun was heavy and cold. Gripping it awkwardly, Harriet crawled sideways down the roof and then turned around on her stomach with the gun in both hands, an inch forward on her elbows as far as she could without actually sticking her head over the edge of the tank. Her vision had narrowed and darkened, and the edge and squeezed itself down to a single eye slit like the visor in a knight's helmet. And Harriet found herself looking out through it with a curious detachment, everything distant and unreal except a sort of sharp, desperate wish to squander her life like a firecracker in a single explosion right in Danny Ratliff's face. Clang, clang. She edged forward, the sun trembling in her grasp, just enough to see over the side. Leaning out a little more, she saw the top of his head, about 15 feet down. Don't look up, thought Harriet frantically. She balanced herself on her elbows, brought the gun up, and centered it on the bridge of her nose, and then, looking down the barrel, lining up the shot as straight as she could, she closed her eyes and squeezed the trigger. Bang! The pistol struck her square in the nose with a loud crack, and she cried out and rolled over on her back to clutch her nose with both hands. A shower of orange sparks spat up in the darkness behind her eyelids. Somewhere deep in the back of her mind, she heard the pistol clattering to the ground, striking the rungs of the ladder with a series of hollow clangs that sounded like somebody running a stick down metal bars at the zoo. But the pain in her nose was so fierce and bright that there had never been anything else like it. Blood gushed between her fingers, hot and slippery. It was all over her hands. She could taste it in her mouth, and as she looked at her hand, at her red fingertips, she couldn't remember exactly where she was for a moment or why she was there. And neither can I. That's all for now, Brobs. Guess I could read one more, get to page 500. Hello? All right, I'll go to 500 since it's only one page. The explosion startled Danny so badly that he nearly lost his grip. A heavy clang rang out on the bar above him, and the next instant something hit him hard on the crown of the head. For a moment he thought he was falling and didn't know what to grab for, and then with the dreamlike jolt he realized that he was still holding tight to the ladder with both hands. Pain swam out from his head in big flat waves like a struck clock, waves that hung in midair and were too slow to dissolve. He'd felt something fall past him. It seemed to him that he'd heard it hit the gravel. He touched his scalp. A knot was rising. He could feel it. And then he turned around as far as he dared and looked down to see if he could make out what had hit him. The sun was in his face, and all he could see below was the elongated shadow of the tank and his own shadow, an elongated scarecrow on the ladder. In the clearing, the windows of the Trans Am were mirrored and blind-looking in the glare. Had Ferris rigged the tower? Danny hadn't thought so, but now he realized he really didn't know for sure. And here he was. He took a step up the ladder and stopped. He thought of going down again to see if he could find the thing that had hit him, and then realized that it would only be a waste of time. What he'd done there, down below, was done. What he had to do now was keep climbing, focus on getting to the top. He did not wish to be blown up. But if I am, he thought desperately, looking down at the bloody car, fuck it. There was nothing to do but keep going. He rubbed the sore place on his head, took a deep breath, and started to climb again. And I will stop there because why not? That's all, Bobs. Goodbye.